All right, we can be seated. Your next witness?
Yes, the people called to the stand, Brandon Nicholas Redwine.
All right. We'll have the witness stand up here, please, sir. And before you sit down, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Have a seat.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Yeah, my name's Nicholas Brandon Redwine. I'm the oldest son of Mark Redwine.
And I think I have to apologize. I think I introduced you as Brandon Nicholas. It's actually Nicholas Brandon?
It's Brandon.
Okay. And how do you prefer to be addressed during this trial?
During this trial, I prefer Brandon.
Okay.
Great.
We'll call you Brandon Redwine from here on out. And Brandon, who's your mother?
Elizabeth Horvath.
Okay. And you said already said your father is
Correct.
Mark Redwine.
Mark Redwine.
And just very briefly, can you identify him in the courtroom for us?
Yeah, he's wearing the gray suit and the green tie.
Okay. Gray tie, is that what you said?
Green tie, sorry.
Green. Okay, thank you. I thought I was going colorblind there for a second.
Record reflects identification of Mr. Redwine.
Thank you very much. Do you have any whole brothers?
I do.
Who's your whole brothers?
Mark Allen Redwine.
Okay.
And then he now changed his name to Roser.
Okay. And do you have any half-brothers?
I do. I have Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine. I have Carter Horvath from another marriage, and then Christina Horvath from another marriage.
Okay.
Just think of us as...
It's more of a family bush than a
Correct.
family tree,
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. And so help me understand the chronology of your family. You were born of the union of Mark Redwine and Betsy Horvath.
Correct.
And then what's the sequence after that?
After that, Mark and Betsy Horvath, they got divorced. We wound up going to Arizona. She met my stepfather, Juice Horvath, and that's where Carter and Christina came into the picture. So.
Okay. And then are you aware of whether Mark Redwine remarried?
I am.
And to who?
He had married Elaine Hall.
Okay. And their children are?
Corey and Dylan.
Okay. Did you have a relationship with, how would you describe your relationship with Mark Redwine, your father, in the fall of 2012?
Fall of 2012, Mark and I had been talking a little bit. It wasn't Facebook, but the app that was before Facebook. We were talking for a little bit, and I just saw something about Dylan being missing, so I did talk to Corey on a more regular basis.
So let me stop you there for a second. I just want to talk about kind of the years, maybe say the decade before, from 2002 to 2012. Were you close with Mark Redwine during that time?
Not at all.
Not
I
at
had
all.
one visit that I came out. It was a court-ordered visit. I believe it was 2002.
Okay. So is it fair to say he wasn't a strong presence in your life?
Objection, Your Honor. Beyond the last question, this is going to stray into 401, 403, 404 area. If there's any further record needed about it, I'd ask to do it at the bench.
You plan on going any further?
No, Your Honor.
All right, well, let's leave it there.
So you testified you had a court-order visitation a few years earlier, and you weren't in real close contact with them.
Correct.
Okay. And as you said, as you testified, as I understand it, as we led into 2012, you were talking with them sporadically. Is that right?
Yeah, just sporadically.
Okay. And tell us about your relationship with Corey and Dylan Redwine.
Corey and Dylan, I always wanted a relationship with all of them. I know there wasn't much of an opportunity. I had the birth of my oldest son, who was born in March of 2008, and I believe Elaine, Corey, and Dylan just happened to be in Arizona, and I don't know the logistics of it, but we met up, we had dinner, and it was a good opportunity to start that conversation again.
How close in age are you and Corey Redwine?
I believe it's 8 to 10 years.
Okay. And then obviously more than that for Dylan?
Correct.
Were you closer with Corey or Dylan?
I felt it was easier to talk to Corey than it was Dylan, just because Dylan didn't understand everything. I was just another random person there. So I think he was shy and timid, and he kind of backed off. I didn't want to push it any further until he was ready.
Do you recall roughly how old he was when you first met him, or you first had this Thanksgiving interaction?
7 or 8.
Okay, so pretty young. But Corey was much closer to your age, is that right?
Correct.
All right. And you started to talk a little bit about finding out that Dylan had gone missing.
Yes.
Can you tell us about how that came to pass?
Yeah, I had just seen something from actually Corey. It was a song that he put out. It was blurry, talking about how just something wasn't right. And I reached out to Corey, and then that's when I started to get more involved.
And let me stop you there. You said it was blurry. When you say blurry, is that the name of the song?
Yeah, sorry, this song is blurry. I can't recall who sings it, but
Okay.
that's the name of the song.
And where did you say that you saw this, that he put this out?
Can't remember if it was texted to me or on Facebook.
Okay. And so he put out some communication that you got, either by text or Facebook, about a song, and that struck your attention. Is that right?
Correct.
And so what did you do after that? Just right after that, when you first saw the post?
I started planning on a trip to Colorado.
Well, did you,
Well,
stop you
sorry.
there. Hold on. Did you actually reach out to Corey?
I reached out to Corey, and
How did you reach out to him?
by phone. It was just a call.
Okay. And is that how you learned that Dylan had gone missing?
Correct. Corey said he was headed back down to Durango, and I followed suit.
Okay. Did you come to Durango or the Vallecito area?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you recall about when that was that you came down to this region?
I want to say it was like November 19th through the 24th.
Okay.
That's my best memory.
Okay. And where were you living at the time?
I was living in Gilbert, Arizona.
Okay. So yes, you drove, or?
Correct.
You
I
drove
drove with my boys and my wife at the time.
Okay. So the whole gang came in. And do you recall where you stayed? Did you get a hotel, or what did you do?
We stayed at the casino in this area. So
Okay.
we stayed there, and we just were kind of hanging out, trying to figure out what was happening.
Okay. And did you have interactions with Corey and Elaine and Mike Hall during that time?
Mostly with Corey. I know we went mini golfing with my kids. We were going to go bowling. We went to a restaurant. We were just kind of trying to figure out what was going on. Obviously, I didn't want to throw my kids into the whole conversation right away, so we tried to make it as age appropriate as we could.
Okay. So you're doing activities to keep the kids busy, and then were you and Corey talking about this whole situation?
Yeah, when we had time, and we were just communicating.
What was your approach to this whole scenario? What were your thoughts coming into this to the situation on the 19th, 20th, 21st, that whole time period?
I knew something wasn't right, so I just wanted to come down and at least get involved as much as I could. And at first, I didn't have any expectations. I just wanted to be involved with getting answers. That's how I always phrased it.
Okay. And when you came down here, and after you got settled in, got the hotel room, et cetera, did you have opportunity to meet up with your father, with Mark Redwine?
Corey and I, we did drive by the house, and Mark was talking with the police. He was being, talked to, so.
Okay. Did you have a chance to have a sit-down with him and Corey at a later time?
Yeah, we did have a sit-down the next night. It was either the same night or the next night.
Okay.
But we just had a quick sit-down. We were just trying to talk about what the game plan was to figure out what was happening.
And tell us about, so who all was present in that sit-down that you had?
In the sit-down, it was myself, Corey was there, Mark, and David Stone.
David Stone.
Correct.
Okay, that's a name we've heard before. Who is David Stone?
David Stone, I believe, is Mark's brother.
Mark's brother. And why was it's probably a stupid question. Do you know why he was here?
I think he was just there for support, is what I took it as. So.
Okay. So it's the four of you, and you sat down. So you thought it was, you said you arrived, you thought around the 19th, pretty early on. Do you remember, and it's fine if you don't remember the exact date, was it pretty early in the process when you had to sit down with Mark and Corey and David Stone?
Yeah, it was within the first week. I know that with 100% certainty.
Okay. And how would you describe Mark Redwine's demeanor during this sit-down, this conversation?
We were just all talking, and I didn't feel like there was a lot of, okay, this is what we should do, this is what we can do. It was more directed by myself and Corey, and David was there, but very limited interactions. So there wasn't much going back and forth, but we were trying to talk about going around, knocking on doors, doing whatever we had to do to find Dylan.
Okay. And as you were talking with Mark about finding Dylan, did he, how did he respond to that?
I would say he wasn't like anxious to get involved. He wasn't like, yeah, let's go do it. There was a lot of back and forth in trying to communicate with both David and Mark, and we just wanted to get going, doing something. It was later in the night, so we were planning on doing something the next morning.
Okay. Did you find yourself expressing any frustration to Mark about his involvement in the search efforts?
Yeah, we were just talking about it, and we kept asking Mark, like, what are you doing to let everybody know that Dylan's not here? And we were trying to encourage him to get more active and letting people know something wasn't right.
Why were you doing that?
Because we still, at that time, in my head, he was still missing. We didn't know anything, but you have to start making noise to at least get that attention. And I'm not saying get negative attention, but just do something so people are aware of it.
And had you seen Mark Redwine engaging in those types of activities to get involved, to make noise, that kind of thing?
I did not know.
Okay. And was that a source of frustration for you?
Yeah, it was frustrating. Just like, it's your son, get involved. Like, make people aware that he's not with you. So.
And during this conversation, was Mark Redwine, did he come across as upset or sad or crying that Dylan was missing, any of those things?
No, I didn't really see any emotion, and that was something that got my attention too. Just, it was a normal, everyday, like, we're going to plan what we're going to do. And I just felt like the situation was very different than that.
And who was leading the planning during this conversation? Who was coming up with the ideas? Who was making the suggestions?
Corey threw out some ideas. I know Mark eventually did throw out some ideas.
Okay.
So I would say primarily Corey and then Mark. And I'm just not familiar with the area, so I was very much just there.
Okay. What happened next? You said you were planning some things out for the next day. Were there things that actually did happen that next day?
Yeah, so the next day, David, myself, and Mark, we just started going around. The goal of what we were going to do, I know we were talking about handing out flyers for Dylan being missing. We went down by Aceto Lake, and we kind of walked around the lake bed, and obviously you know what you're looking for, so that was tense, I would say.
Okay.
But,
Let me stop you there for just a second. You said it was yourself and David and Mark. Was Corey not on this drive?
no, Corey had elected not to go on that drive.
Okay. do you recall that you have told other, like the investigators or in interviews, you stated that Corey was there?
I don't recall. I know Corey definitely wasn't there,
Okay.
so it could have been a misunderstanding. I know Corey was a part of the conversations the night before, so I think that's how it could have gotten tangled up.
Okay, so Corey was not in the car with you?
He was not.
Okay. And so where did you and Mark and David Stone all met up? Where did you meet up?
We met up at Mark's house, and then we went and we grabbed some lunch at a little gas station, is how I'd phrase it. And then we just went down to Vallecito Lake, and we started walking around on the lake bed.
Okay. And you were kind of walking the shoreline, is that?
Correct.
Okay. And how long did that go on for?
I'd say we were there for about an hour.
Okay. What did you do after that?
After that, we just jumped in the truck, and we were just driving around, and that's where we were going to hand out the missing Dylan flyers. Okay.
Do you remember which truck you were in?
I don't remember.
That's fine. And were you in the front seat or the back seat?
I was in the back seat.
Okay. And did you in fact drive around and start handing out flyers?
We were driving around for about 20 minutes. We never handed out flyers.
Where did you drive?
We were, to my understanding, it was basically up Middle Mountain, like up that mountain.
Okay. And tell us about that drive. What was going on during that drive? What were the people doing? What were you all talking about?
There was a lot of small talk about David and him being up here, and just small talk. We were briefly talking about Dylan. There wasn't any, like, it was just small talk.
Small talk. Like, how's work going? Those kinds of things?
Just catching up with somebody, because I don't think David had been up here in quite a while. So.
And this is just a couple of days after Dylan goes missing, right? Still in the same time frame?
Correct.
Okay. And there was not much talk about Dylan at all. Is that what you said?
Objection asked and answered. It was probably objectionable the first time. This is not consistent with the court's allowance of hearsay testimony. There is a specifically denied or defined area that is allowed on inquiry about that kind of stuff. So have to keep it limited to that.
One, it's not hearsay, so the objection's overruled. We went through this earlier in the trial as to what hearsay is. Number two, I'm going to allow it. I don't remember. Maybe it was asked and answered, but I apparently missed it, so go ahead.
Okay. Did Mark specifically bring up Dylan, or do you recall how that came to pass?
It was very minimal conversation about Dylan.
What were you doing while you were in the car and driving up Middle Mountain Road?
I was looking around on this side, like I wasn't driving, so I didn't have much control over where we were going, but I kept looking just in case I did see something. And I was just trying to get a better feel for Mark and David Stone. So I was just trying to kind of ease my way into that situation.
Okay. And are you sort of looking out, like through the window, like out
Correct.
onto the side of the road and that sort of thing? Did you see anything of importance?
I did not see anything that caught my attention.
Were you able to observe what Mark and David Stone were doing in the front seat?
I was not able to see anything specifically.
Okay. How long, or do you recall how long you were driving around or driving there on Middle Mountain Road?
I'd say we were driving up it for about 20 or 25 minutes.
Okay. And after that amount of time, did you in fact turn around and go back down at some point?
We didn't turn around to my recollection. I know there was somebody that wanted to put Mark on TV, and I figured that's a good way to get the story out, because we got to talk about it if people are going to know about it.
Let me rephrase the question, because I think I probably asked a poor question. During that drive, as you're going through this 25-minute drive, did Mark say anything about Dylan Redwine and the Middle Mountain area?
Yeah. Again, there was some very casual small talk. I know there was a phrase that, as we're just driving up with a small talk, that I heard that I found highly abnormal, where Mark said, okay, he's not up here, we can hand these out. And
why do you say that? Let me make sure I'm clear. He said he's not up here. Why does that strike you as abnormal?
because we're looking for a missing child and we're handing out flyers for a missing child. And I found it very strange that I'm being told, okay, he's not here, so we can do what we went there to do. That just didn't make sense to me.
Meaning the flyers, like hand out the
Hand out
flyers?
the flyers.
Is that around the time that you guys turned around?
About that time, yes.
Okay.
We went to do the interview.
So after you heard him say, he's not up here, we can go hand out the flyers, or whatever the exact words were, how did that influence your perception of this whole situation and Mark Redwine, the whole scenario?
I took that and I figured Mark knows something. I didn't know what he knew. I didn't know how he knew it. But
Your Honor, if I may, this is pure speculation. Objection.
Mr. Champagne?
Your Honor, the witness is testifying about his perception of how
Right.
this, his understanding of this whole scenario. And
But why is his perception really relevant?
well, it's going to be relevant to show the next steps and actions and things that he did as the months wore on.
Well, you have gotten out what you've gotten out, and you can stop there and,
Okay.
and you can move on.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Well, let me just stop there. Hold on one second. You said that you never actually handed out the flyers.
no, we did not.
Did you go and follow through with a TV interview like you described?
Correct. We went and we did the TV interview.
Okay. You said you stayed around in this region for about 4 days, right? Or 4 or 5 days, is that right?
About that, correct?
And during that whole stretch of time, what was Mark Redwine's attitude towards participating in the searches for Dylan?
I didn't really see Mark get involved. I know I would talk to him about some things, but there was no action.
And how would you describe his demeanor and attitude towards the fact that Dylan was missing over those 5 days?
It was hard because I never saw emotion. I know as a dad, I don't have my kids. I'm worried. I never saw that worry. So
And in the months after Dylan's disappearance, after you left town, did you keep in touch with Mark Redwine more frequently?
yeah, we started talking a little bit more. Like I said earlier, I figured he would have the best understanding of what happened, and I felt like he always knew more than what he was sharing.
Did you initiate the conversations or the sort of increase in volume of contact between the two of you?
I would say yes.
Okay. And why was that?
I just wanted to know what was going on with my brother Dylan, and I wanted to get more answers, so I figured talking is the best way to get answers.
In February of 2000, well, let me just stop there for a second. Were you also having ongoing conversations with Corey Redwine and Elaine Hall over that time period?
Yeah, I was talking with Corey, and I would talk to Elaine when I had an opportunity.
Okay. Did you end up, in February of 2013, did you end up getting connected with and speaking with Tanya Galbraith of the La Plata County Sheriff's Office?
I did.
Okay. And how did that come to pass, if you know?
I remember we were coming back to Durango for a vigil, and I don't remember exactly how I came in contact with Tanya, but I know I started talking with Tanya.
Okay. Was it an in-person meeting or a telephone call?
Yeah, we met at the police station, and we were just kind of, I don't remember what exactly we were talking about, but we were talking about Dylan.
And were there any things that you wanted to share with Investigator Galbraith during that meeting?
At that time, there were always conversations that I was having and
With who?
with Mark, And I felt like there's something that he's not telling us fully. So I did talk to her about those calls.
Okay. Do you remember any specific conversations or statements from Mark Redwine that stuck out to you that you wanted to share with us?
Over the amount of time that I was talking to him, there were a lot of things, but about that time, we still didn't have any idea of where he was, and there was a lot of conversations about how Dylan could have been hurt, whether it was hunters, whether he was attacked by animals, and he always said with or if it was blunt force trauma, but his voice changed so distinctively when it came to blunt force trauma. That's what I was talking to Tanya about.
And let me stop you there for a second, because we're going to get to that topic in just a second. But do you remember him saying that he knew where Dylan was?
I do remember.
What did he say to you?
I was talking to him, and if you know where he's at, why are we still looking? And he was just telling me, Dylan's in my heart. And I remember thinking, that's just a BS answer. Like, it doesn't make sense that as your son missing.
Do you remember the exact phrase, how he said it?
He said, Dylan's in my heart.
Did he say, I know where Dylan is?
I know where Dylan's at. He's in my heart.
Okay. And you said that struck you as kind of a BS answer, right?
Correct.
Asked and answered. And this line of inquiry is not relevant. The speculation as to how this is meant is more prejudicial and prohibitive under 403. So, Judge.
I'm going to overrule you on the 403. Let's move on, Mr. Champagne.
Okay. How would you describe your feeling about Mark Redwine and his involvement in Dylan's disappearance during this time? Were you suspicious or curious? What's the word that you would use?
4143.
It's fine. Go ahead and answer the question, or you can ask it again.
Can you repeat it?
I'm trying to help the jury understand, like, during this time period, what you're feeling towards about Mark Redwine's involvement in any of this, and whether you had concern or what word you would use to describe your feeling about Mark Redwine based on these conversations that you had with him.
My feelings were that he just wasn't telling us everything. He's hiding something.
Objection, move to strike. That's exactly what we're talking about. That's the 401, 403 problem.
I don't think it is. I've ruled against you. The jury can take it for what it's worth. It's certainly an area for argument for both sides.
I'm just concerned.
So, I mean, you're going to be overruled on this. So, if you want to make a record, go ahead.
The record is just a speculation about knowing what someone else knows and that they're not letting on more is beyond the capacity of people who aren't psychics.
Well, that's maybe beyond people who say they're psychics, too. So, you're overruled. And when he's saying things like, I know where Dylan he's in my heart, did that increase your suspicion as well?
It did. I just felt like he's telling me what I wanted him to say, and he's not doing anything to actually get answers, is how I always took it.
And over these months, as the fall and winter of 2012 wore on, and Dylan's still missing, and we move into the spring of 2013, were you aware of Mark's participation or lack of participation in the search efforts to find Dylan?
I was not aware of Mark being involved in any of the search efforts. I know we did have conversations about how he was going to do something, but there was nothing that ever actually happened.
Objection. The foundation necessary here would require hearsay. Objection.
Well, it might. You may be right about that, but I don't know that. You move to strike it, let's lay a foundation.
How do you know that?
He wasn't doing anything. We were talking on a pretty regular basis, and he would have told me about the searches that he was doing.
And he didn't tell you?
No, there was never any, like, result of what he said was going to happen.
Did he give you, let me ask you this, during these conversations, how, you're having extended conversations or these short little snippets?
I'd say most of our calls were about an hour long.
Okay. During these extended conversations that you're having with him, were you identifying any sort of patterns of like the topics that he would bring up or talk about?
Most of what I felt Mark chose to talk about was things that, like, Elaine was doing, or things that Kat was doing.
Sorry, who's Kat? Do you know her real name?
Denise Hess, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
So, but talking about what they were doing, and I know I did make a couple comments to them, like, stop worrying about what they're doing. Let's do something.
And when you were talking with him and the topic of Dylan came up, was it generally from Mark Redwine bringing that into the conversation, or was it you bringing that into the conversation?
It was primarily me bringing it up. I was, again, just trying to figure out if there was more to know about it. I wanted to have that conversation with Mark so I could hear it. So.
Were you bringing it up on purpose?
I was talking to Mark just to understand how things were going in his life, and then just to figure out what's going on with Dylan. So at that point, I still had a brother that was missing. I wanted to get answers, so I did bring that up on a regular basis.
Okay. And as we moved out from this is going on in the fall and the spring of fall of 2012, winter 2012, spring 2013, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Did you, around that same time, did you end up coming down to this region again for, I think you said you came down for a vigil, is that right?
I did come down here for a vigil as well.
Okay. And did you meet up with Mark Redwine during that time?
It was a very brief interaction, but I did see him there.
Okay. Was that was before Dylan's remains had been located, right?
Correct.
I want to turn your attention now to June of 2013. How did you first find out that Dylan's remains had been found and that Dylan was dead?
It was a text message, I believe, from my mom about that.
Okay. And do you recall a conversation that you had with Mark Redwine the same day that it was revealed that Dylan was gone?
I remember giving Mark a call just to get his insight on, that's terrible news. I wanted to hear from him how he was taking it.
Okay. And tell us about that conversation.
I remember Mark, he was very stoic, and I didn't understand that, because if it were my son, I would be a lot more emotional. And I know that's me, but it didn't seem to be a reaction to finding out that your son that you've been looking for is no longer coming home.
Was he crying at all?
Pardon me. Objection to the continued inquiry about the cut of Mr. Redwine's jib. It's not relevant. It's speculative. It's more prejudicial than probative. Objection.
The prosecution's trying to prove state of mind and his reaction to things, which is very relevant in this type of case. And so this is you can consider this to be a continuing objection, so you don't have to object anymore throughout the remainder of this testimony as to that issue. Go ahead.
Thank you. Was he crying at all during this conversation?
No.
How long did you talk with him? Do you recall?
Over time or that day?
No, just on that one day.
I'd say it was about an hour.
Okay. And during that conversation, besides the fact that you described him as stoic. What do you mean by stoic?
Just, I think, getting that news that we were talking about, there was no, sadness, or there's no, distraughtness that I was getting from him at all. It was just a very normal conversation, like I was talking about the Rockies or talking about something that was more a joyous, like personal character, a personal like, I guess.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the
A
last
personal
part.
like. I said it was like we were talking baseball or something.
Okay.
It was not related. The reactions I was getting didn't relate to a missing child or a child that wasn't coming home.
And you said earlier, you referred to him using the phrase blunt force trauma. Is that right?
Correct.
And when was the first time when was the first time you heard him use that phrase? Was it during this conversation?
It was because we were talking about the remains. I asked Mark what was found, and he did tell me a fingertip, a collarbone, and a fingerbone, or a fingertip. And then I was trying to get information about what he thought happened. I thought that was something, he knows this area better than me, so I wanted to know what Mark thought. And he would talk to me about different possible outcomes, like animal attacks or being shot by hunters, and then he'd always go back to blunt force trauma. And it was just such a distinctively different way of talking any other time. So that's what got my attention.
Help me understand. I mean, it sounds like you're listening very closely to the way he's talking, described his demeanor, lack of emotion. Did it change? Did his inflection or his voice or change when he used the term blunt force trauma?
No, his emotion didn't change, but his voice, there's a lot more passion in the way he was saying it, and that just caught me off guard because I didn't understand.
Had you ever brought up to him this idea of blunt force trauma, like prior in the conversation, anything
Never.
like that?
I never did.
And had you ever heard anybody else talking to him about blunt force trauma when you were around him?
Not to Mark. The only other time I've heard it is on TV in the shows.
Okay. So he brought it up to you, and how, you said his voice was more passionate? What do you mean? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, so he's just talking, and then when he went to blunt force trauma, like I just said blunt force trauma in the same way, but with him it was always blunt force trauma, very direct, and that always, it got my attention on a very big level.
On a very big level? Okay. Well, how did it strike you, or what did you take away from that?
I always, I would have the conversations, and I remember telling my wife, he's telling me what happened, and he's not telling me what exactly was used, but we don't have enough information to be thinking about blunt force trauma. It just shocked me a little bit because I didn't see where it was coming from.
One moment, please. How many times did he mention that phrase, blunt force trauma, during that conversation?
I would say about 4.
And again, this is the same day that the remains were found of his son?
The remains, but no skull, and that's what caught me off guard because the limited that we found has nothing to do with blunt force trauma.
And what did you do after that conversation was over? Sorry, after that conversation was over, and having this feeling that you had as you described, he was telling me what he did. What did you do with that? How did you react?
Correct. The conversation was over, and I sent Tanya Goldbright an email just letting her know, this doesn't seem right. And I figured she's going to have the ability to look into it further.
Now, after you reached out to Tanya Goldbright, did you continue to communicate with her throughout the course of the case about your conversations with Mark Redwine?
I would on occasion.
One moment, please. And you said that you sent Tanya Goldbright a text message, I think is what you said, or is it an email? Something like that.
It was an email.
Okay. And did you mention in your conversation with her that he had used blunt force trauma several times?
Correct.
During this conversation?
Yes, sir.
At this point, I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Moran?
Good afternoon. So, fair to say that you called him on subsequent occasions and wanted him to continue talking about blunt force trauma?
I didn't call him to talk about blunt force trauma. That was brought up by Mark.
You knew that was going to be something that was useful to law enforcement, though, right?
I did not know that was going to be useful to give to law enforcement, but I figured.
Well, you reached out to Tanya Goldbright.
I did.
Okay. And you were recording the conversations that you were having with your father, right?
I started at about that time, yes.
And so if there was really this big difference in the way he says blunt force trauma versus how he says other words, those recordings exist and can be provided to the jury.
They can, yes.
I want to start with the flyers. You're aware that Mr. Redwine, that your father, had flyers made up that were giving information about who to reach out to in the event that someone had information about Dylan, right?
I am aware of that.
And, in fact, he was out looking with you for his son Dylan, right?
We were on Vallecito Lake, and we were going to go hand out flyers, but the thing that I want to be known is we never actually handed those flyers out.
Sure.
So we had the plan.
You don't know whether those flyers were ever handed out. They were just not with the day that was with you, right?
Correct. I do not know.
Okay. And your dad had business cards that he was providing to people with Dylan's information on it, right?
That is correct.
And you encouraged your dad to go on the Dr. Phil's television program that has a national audience, right?
I did when.
And as we all know, he did that.
Correct.
And that was despite the fact that, as you discussed that with him, you were noting for your dad that that Dr. Phil, quote, exploits other people's misfortune. That was your take on what would happen on Dr. Phil.
I think that's not exactly true. I said I think Dr. Phil, he's obviously very well known. I think he makes money off of this kind of stuff. I may have made a comment about that because obviously that's what he makes his money off of.
Would you agree that there were a minimum of 10 phone calls with your dad?
Yes.
And as you were discussing with Mr. Champagne a moment ago, get that language right, there were extended conversations, right?
That is correct.
He'd say things to you like he just wanted...
Objection. Hearsay, self-serving hearsay. We've been over this many, many times during the trial.
The prosecution elicited, and that's why I wrote it down, the extended conversation spanning months with Brandon and cherry-picking certain remarks out of these conversations.
He hasn't said what's being said yet.
This is a speaking objection that's designed to...
This part is okay because he's not relaying to the jury the content of the conversation. So let him finish what he's saying. Go ahead, Mr. Redwine.
The information elicited by the prosecution was that Mr. Redwine wasn't expressing emotion around what was going on, and I think that the language of the discussions they were having said something entirely different, that there was a lacking care for what happened to his child. The conversations that they had and the transcripts that I reviewed showed different. So the impression that the jury would be left with, I think, is misleading. That he's stoic and doesn't seem to care and discusses the loss of his child and what's going on with him as a Super Bowl baseball.
So you're asking this to come in under the rule of completeness.
106, please.
Mr. Champagne.
Your Honor, this is, these conversations are not recorded because these are the early stages of the conversation. So there is no true way to analyze rule of completeness in this context. right? What we have is the statements essentially from Brandon Redwine about those conversations. There's no transcript here. There's no way to say whether this is in context or not out of context.
I guess I can't make a ruling unless I know what they say, and that's not appropriate to the jury. So if you have a report that I could review, and we'll have to make it an exhibit. Well, great. Is that there?
As Nick Redwine was just testifying, there were a minimum of 10 phone calls, and some of them were approaching at least an hour. So there are extensive conversations, and that's, I think, what Mr. Champagne meant when he was saying, you know, were you observing patterns over the course of these extended conversations? And under 106, any other writing or reported statements which ought, in fairness, to be considered.
I know, I'm agreeing with you on 106, but the question is I have to make a determination as to whether or not it should be, in fairness, should be considered. And without a pretrial hearing on this, like you probably should have had, on both of you, perhaps, I don't know, it's just kind of difficult to do in the middle of the trial, isn't it?
It is, and I'm happy to make an offer of proof. I have some that I think maybe we could discuss outside the presence of the jury, but there are some that I think are so directly tied to what was listed on direct examination. I can move through that.
Well, you know, it's a lot easier, ladies and gentlemen, when we use this jury room, but with COVID and the size, number of jurors we have, it's a problem. Why don't, how long do you think this will take? Any idea?
Hopefully not so long, 10 minutes.
All right. Why don't you guys take a break? We'll call you when we're ready. And if it ends up being too long, I'll figure something else out. All right? Everybody rise for the jury. Go on down to the jury room, please. Don't talk about the case. I wasn't paying attention.
And I apologize for that too.
You don't know. That's all right. But you may need to stay here. I don't know. So have a seat. Everybody have a seat, please. Record can reflect the jury's left the courtroom and the door is shut. So.
Your Honor, I would also, it's sort of adjacent to sequestration to have Mr. Nick Redwine not present as we're discussing all of this.
Well, don't, maybe, I guess I don't care. I'm just looking at, am I going to be you're going to be talking about what's in the reports?
Yes, sir.
All right, why don't you wait outside? All right, Mr. Redwine's gone. Go ahead.
Your Honor, in view of a desire for personal and judicial economy, I was listening intently, wondering if the questions would be asked so broadly as to properly allow us to invoke 106, and they absolutely were. So without the things that I need to make, I'll make an offer of proof on right now, I think that we would be in violation of 106, which, of course, as Your Honor is well aware, favors admission. And when the conversation on direct is that over the amount of time, there's a lot of things discussed in the calls, that's a direct quote, then there's this extended, so he wasn't searching, he was saying weird stuff, he didn't show emotion, didn't seem to care. Those things are rebutted and should be properly considered in fairness contemporaneously with things like that Mr. Redwine was emoting and saying, I wish I had somebody who believed and trusted me, that is there anything, and then Brandon saying, is there anything I can do to help you get through this? I think that shows that there is emotion that Brandon's observing, that he abuts what he was suggesting, that wasn't happening, that it was just stoic. There was conversations about specifically with respect to possible mechanisms of injury or death for Dylan, that shooting, stabbing, smashed in the head, natural causes, accidents, furry animals, bears, wolves, mountain lions, coyotes, abduction. The fear that Mr. Redwine experienced around thinking that his child was somewhere out in the woods screaming for help. He would say things like, but that hearing and using language like skeletal remains were words that felt gross. And I have citations for all of this information. These are things that these two Redwine gentlemen discussed over the phone. Also, it would include Mark saying things like, "I miss my son every freaking day." That's a quote. Pardon me on the language there. There was something about how it's really strange, and it stood out that Mr. Redwine was saying that my son lives in my heart. That's maybe not the language I would use, but I think that that's appropriately emoting, particularly taken in context of him saying things like, "I talked to him," Mark's referring to Dylan, I keep pictures around of him, he's thought that my whole life, the world revolves around him. He lamented that he and Elaine all couldn't put aside their differences, cooperate in finding Dylan, rebuts this suggestion that Mark was just very strangely saying rotten things about Elaine. There's evidence to the contrary of that I think is necessary for the jury to consider so that they have a full picture of the information here. Further, these are all examples of the way he talked about Dylan: wonderful person, giving, funny, good friend, happy for the most part, would gladly give my life so that he can have his. These are the sorts of things that a grieving father would say about their child, and it rebuts the notion that's been created by the direct examination of the prosecution that Mr. Redwine was very stoic and didn't emote properly around the death of his child.
Mr. Champagne?
Your Honor, prosecution was very intentional and very specific about the conversations and the time period to which we directed our examination of Brandon Redwine. And to be very clear, there was the conversation when he first got down here and arrived in the area, sometime, the days between November 19th and November 24th, 2012. None of those statements are reported statements. There was a conversation when he came down for the vigil that was just touched on very briefly. There was almost no testimony that even came out of it. And the only other conversation that was specifically referred to was on June 27th, 2013, the same day Mark Redwine found out that his son's remains were found on Middle Mountain.
But you've also brought out that on various conversations it just struck this witness that he didn't say flat affect, but I guess that's the way I took it, that there wasn't hardly any emotion. I think it's fair game for cross-examination into that. This is not the rule of completeness, by the way, now that I've looked at it again. But this is not the entry, this is not a recorded statement or a related writing that's being introduced. However, the theory is the same. I think you can ask him, since that was the impression that was given, that there was no, there's a difference between the way he says things and what he said. And maybe you can go into that on your redirect that. We'll see.
Your Honor.
But I do believe that they're entitled to go into it when you've left the impression that he just didn't care, which is the impression that you've left.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you.
It's all right.
I did have a couple of more points that I wanted.
Well, then I interrupted you too soon, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Judge. In this case, there are, in fact, many hours of recorded conversations that Mr. Moran has in his white notebook over there, and that's what he's citing to you. He's trying to use this vehicle of the rule of completeness and expand it so broadly to include every other conversation they've ever had, so that he can specifically use the self-serving hearsay comments, quotations of Mark Redwine to introduce into this case. And I think that is patently improper.
Well, isn't this being introduced to show that he's wrong, that there was some emotion? So therefore, and again, why is that hearsay? I'd give my life for him.
Right.
Well, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but that's not why it's being introduced. So it's not hearsay. It's the same objection they've been making, which has been wrong throughout the whole trial. So,
I don't disagree that, you know, if they want to say there were times that he was upset, there were times that he was sad, that's fine. I think that they can definitely do that. But I think when we're talking about specific quotations of the defendant, I do think that veers well afield of what we've discussed. And I would also say it's beyond the scope of the conversations that we have discussed in the case. So our conversations go up to and include June 27th and no later. And if they want to get into later conversations, well, I don't know, maybe they can recall them, maybe they can't. But I would also argue that's definitely beyond the scope of what we have discussed.
well, on the dates, these, Mr. Moran, are you talking about conversations after June 27th of 2012 or not? Or 2013, excuse me?
Yes, 100%, because there's nothing recorded prior to that date.
Okay, I'm done talking to you.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Your Honor, my intention is to confine what I want to inquire about to whether there was emotion, the impression that's been left that Mr. Redwine didn't care, and that there were repeated discussions about ways that Dylan could have gotten. Because where we're at right now.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. My question was, can you confine it to before Dylan's remains were found?
There was a
Because that's what was presented.
Your Honor, I would disagree based on the fact that there was discussion, quote, that there were conversations where there were observations of patterns. But that wasn't limited to.
Well, it wasn't limited to the blunt force trauma, I think, was about that date, but before the cranium was found. So I agree with you there. But I think other than that, I think you're somewhat limited, aren't you?
Judge, I'm also referring and relying on how it was said that over amount of time, there was a lot of things discussed in the call. So we're talking about a wider range and a specific question.
I'm going to limit you to pretty much June of 2013, because if I remember my testimony correctly, that was before the cranium was found. So anything before that, I think is fair game. You can ask them about it. Do you remember telling Tanya Goldbright or wherever that report comes from about it? I don't see that being a problem. I don't think it's hearsay. I think it's if he doesn't remember it, it does contradict his previous testimony to some degree. I think there's maybe some ways around it. However, I can see further objections because the two of you are not going to agree on those unless you think you can. I mean, do you need some time to prepare that? Do we need to have cross-examination maybe tomorrow morning so you have time to look at that to make sure that you're before those dates, or are your reports good enough that you can just go through that?
No, I don't have these limited by date, but I'm happy to do that. Again, I need to stress that because this is a discussion about patterns that were observed over time, we're not confined to just June and prior to that.
And I'm ruling against you on that because that's what I believe the testimony was. If I'm wrong, you can appeal me. Okay? So with that, should we just save that cross-examination for tomorrow morning, and then maybe you want to bring up another witness, or what do the parties want to do?
Judge, I can tell you 100% beyond any shadow of any doubt, there are no recorded conversations.
Doesn't matter if they're recorded.
So any quotations, any recorded transcripts, anything that...
We're not talking about recorded. These are statements that were reported to Tanya Goldbright of conversations. Right. Not when they were reported, but conversations before the first set of remains were found.
And I think what you'll find is that Mr. Moran will probably agree there are no real reports prior to June 27th. That is the sort of
it's not, no, because the testimony was that he was talking to Mr. Redwine prior to the remains being found.
Yes.
And then pretty much at the time the remains were found. It doesn't matter when the reports were, it matters when the conversations occurred. And that's why I thought there would be a problem if we just went into it today and you guys would be fighting and I'd be sending the jury out again. All right? I
appreciate that, Judge.
So I think you both better do some homework tonight and take a look at what conversations those were and be ready to do it in the morning. So my question to you is, do you have somebody else who's ready to come up and testify?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, great. Let's take another 5 minutes. You guys can take a little bit of a break, because I need one. And we'll come back in here in 5-7 minutes, and then we'll have a jury come up.
Okay.